Thank you for joining us today for the EU MDR transition. This is a series of 3 webinars we will be hosting, and we will provide the other links to you throughout the presentation. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which we meet here today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here online with us today. So I'd like to introduce you to Amanda Craig, who is on the screen there for you now. Amanda joined the TGA in 2014 and is currently the Director of the Device Post-Market Reforms and Review section within the Medical Device Surveillance branch. As part of her role, Amanda represents the TGA on several international and national working groups and steering committees, including the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, Adverse Event Workshop Working Group, Standards Australia Medical Gas Systems Committee, Australian Breast Device Registry Steering Committee, and the Australasian Pelvic Floor Procedures Registry. Amanda holds a range of academic qualifications in neuroscience and forensic science. Thank you, Amanda. And then I'd like to introduce you to Jing Ling, who joined the TGA in 2020 and is currently the Director of the Device Applications section within the Medical Device Authorisation branch. The section comprises of medical device assessors responsible for the regulatory and technical assessment of applications for the inclusions of medical devices in the ARTG. She has prior experience in administering intellectual property rights for medical devices at IP Australia, as well as managing reforms and project deliveries at the Australian National University. She has a special interest in medical innovation and enabling health outcomes. She holds a Master's of Biomedical Engineering from the University of New South Wales and a PhD in the Neuroscience from the Australian National University. So I'm going to now pass over to you to start today. Thanks, Jing Ling.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us here today for the first of 3 webinars on the EU MDR transition. So this is a significant program of work which commenced over 18 months ago with industry, and we're really pleased to be able to share with you today the policy approaches and resources that have been developed to support manufacturers and sponsors under our regulatory framework as they transition their medical devices to the new European medical device regulations. In today's webinar, I will be covering the background of the EU MDR transition, implications for medical device ARTG inclusions, and provide an overview of the TGA's approach to the transition under the Australian Medical Device Regulatory Framework. I will run through the various resources available to manufacturers and sponsors and will then pass it on to Amanda, who will work through some examples to highlight and clarify regulatory obligations for both devices that are transitioning to the EU MDR and also for devices that are not transitioning. We will also touch on some fee reduction measures to ease regulatory costs for sponsors. And lastly, we'll end with a page of online resources that you can refer to before moving into the Q&A segment. So as many of you are aware, most medical devices in the ARTG are supported by European certification. In 2017, a major update to medical device regulations in Europe was introduced. And the new European Medical Device Regulations replaces the Medical Devices Directives and the Active Implantable Medical Devices Directives, and is designed to modernize the European regulatory system to better address the current needs of the market and new technology. And the transition from the EU MDD to the EU MDR has introduced changes for medical device manufacturers, such as more stringent requirements to demonstrate medical device safety for patients and users, including stronger requirements for clinical evidence, and also additional requirements for the manufacturer's quality management system, more detailed technical document requirements, changes to classification rules for some devices. And the transition ends on the 26th of May 2024, where devices supported by EU MDD certification will need to transition to the new EU MDR certification in order to continue supply. And so this has flow-on implications for sponsors of medical device ARTG inclusions in Australia. The regulatory actions that may be required from sponsors include updating their manufacturer evidence or conformity assessment documents that are associated with their ARTG entries. possibly applying for new applications for inclusion as a result of changes to device classification, where this may be due to changes in classification rules or due to changes in the manufacturer's intended purpose for the device as a result of the transition. There might be amendments to ARTG entries, such as changes to intended purpose or functional description, recall actions or notifications to end users due to device changes, or consent to supply due to non-compliance with essential principles. So we have conducted workshops as we do recognize the scale of the EU MDR transition and the large numbers of ARTG entries that will require transitioning to the EU MDR is unprecedented. So in order to minimize regulatory burden, cost, and also impact on supply, a risk-based and streamlined approach is being adopted to allow the transition of medical devices in the ARTG from the EU MDD to the EU MDR that does not compromise the safety, quality, or performance of medical devices supplied in Australia. So we've conducted a number of workshops and also consulted with industry, primarily through the Regulatory and Technical Consultative Forum for Medical Devices, known as the RegTech, to seek their views and feedback on proposed strategies. The final implementation strategy and policy approach, which Amanda and I will be stepping through in the coming slides, include outlining the range of regulatory actions in relation to the transition under our framework, an EU MDR transition-specific streamlined process for sponsors to notify the market of low-risk changes, handling approaches for devices which are not transitioning to the EU MDR, as well as handling approaches for devices which are transitioning but may have a gap or an overlap in their certification. And lastly, some fee reduction measures to relieve sponsors of regulatory costs associated with the large number of regulatory and processing actions. So here we have a table outlining the summary of regulatory actions that may be required under the Australian Medical Device Framework. If a new MDR certification has been issued, sponsors can update their manufacturer evidence on file to an EU MDR certificate by submitting an ME variation application. Alternatively, if sponsors are seeking to retain the old manufacturer evidence on file, as it might be linked to other ARTG entries, they can submit a new ME application, and when that is accepted, to then submit a device change request to link their entry to the new manufacturer evidence. And if the device classification has changed as a result of transitioning to the EU MDR, they would then need to lodge a new application for inclusion for their affected ARTG entry. And if the transition has resulted in changes to the intended purpose, GMDN code and term, manufacturer details such as the name and or address, or the need to link the new EU MDR certificate to an existing ARTG inclusion, then sponsors can update their ARTG entries by submitting a device change request application. And for Class 3 and AIMD devices, if the transition has resulted in changes to the total number of devices, variant list, unique product identifier, or functional description, then sponsors can update their ARTG entries by submitting a variation application. And if there are changes to indications in the IFU or the class of persons for which the device is suitable for, or a reduction in scope of intended purpose or functional description, or the need to have an addition of warning for a newly identified safety signal or contraindication, or the addition of adverse event information, which would change patient management recommendations, then recalls or market notifications may be required. So we have introduced a streamlined market notification process for qualifying sponsors, which we'll be talking through in the coming slides. And for devices that became non-compliant with the essential principles, sponsors will need to lodge a consent to supply application for their affected ARTG entries. And lastly, for devices where there have been a lapse in the conformity assessment certification, sponsors will need to notify the TGA. So we have published an online assessment tool that will assist sponsors in determining what actions they may or may not need to take as a result of transitioning their ARTG entries from the EU MDD to the EU MDR. So this online tool will walk you through a series of questions, and depending on your responses, you will be guided on the most appropriate actions to take and the forms to use. This is an optional tool and can be used at any time to assist sponsors in meeting their obligations. It is important to note that this tool is not designed for in vitro diagnostic medical devices. So work is underway for the EU IVDR transition, and sponsors can expect guidance and other resources to support their transition in the coming months. So to reduce regulatory burden on sponsors and on healthcare providers, we have introduced the concept of a streamlined market notification, which is specific to the EU MDR transition. So a market notification is a notification from sponsors to consumers about information relating to MDD certified device stock that is already supplied in the Australian market. So a market notification provides information about a therapeutic good in a situation that is unlikely to involve significant adverse health consequences. So for low-risk device changes as a result of the EU MDR, if certain criteria are met, sponsors can undertake streamlined market notifications and do not need to submit these as separate recall notifications to the TGA recalls section. For sponsors who qualify for streamlined market notifications, they can either submit an online notification form to provide market notifications to healthcare providers and/or end users using the TGA's web publication service, or they could choose to notify healthcare providers and/or end users about changes to their devices, making documentation to confirm that the notifications had occurred and be able to produce them to the TGA upon request. So here we have the eligibility criteria for streamlined market notifications. And it's important to note that all of the 6 criteria will need to be met in order for sponsors to qualify. So the first criteria is that the changes being notified only relate to devices that are transitioning from the EU MDD to the EU MDR certification and are not due to safety issues or defects. The second criteria is that the devices comply with all Australian regulatory requirements when supplied to the market. The third criteria is that there are no deficiencies in the safety, quality, performance, or presentation of the device as currently supplied to the market. The fourth criteria is that the changes that are being notified are not because of any reported safety-related incidents that have resulted in patient or user harm. The fifth criteria is that the changes being notified are not because of any signals arising from adverse event reporting and investigation. And lastly, the final criteria is that the devices were manufactured whilst a conformity assessment certificate was valid. And here we have a screenshot of the online notification form for sponsors wishing to utilize the TGA's web publication service to notify healthcare providers and/or end users of changes to their devices. And this form can be accessed from our website. And for sponsors who have chosen to utilize the online notification form, the data submitted will be collated by TGA staff and will be published to the TGA's EU MDR web publication service on a weekly basis. And it is really important to note that it is the sponsor's responsibility to advise healthcare providers and/or end users of the web publication service. Over to your right, you can see that's a screenshot of the landing page of the web publication service. And over to your left, that is a sample of what the downloadable file will look like and which will be updated on a weekly basis. We've also published a suite of guidance material on the 1st of December, and all sponsors of medical device ARTG inclusions who hold manufacturer evidence with the TGA would have received an email with links to this material. And the guidance material is segmented into different topics, covering manufacturer's evidence, device change requests and variations, recalls and market notifications, conformity assessment, essential principles, and consent to supply. Example scenarios and FAQs are also incorporated into the guidance to clarify regulatory obligations. So to recap, we have developed a suite of guidance material that is available on our website to assist sponsors and manufacturers. We have an optional online assessment tool that will assist sponsors to determine regulatory actions for their device changes. And we also have an online notification form for sponsors of medical devices who do qualify for streamlined market notifications to utilize the EU MDR web publication service to advise healthcare providers and end users of low-risk changes as a result of the transition. And I'll pass it over to Amanda now, who will be stepping us through the various handling approaches for transitioning and non-transitioning devices. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Shinlin. We'll be shortly moving into the various handling approaches for the transitioning and examples of some medical devices that are going to transition with the EU MDR. But before we do that, I thought I'd step you through the regulatory obligations, taking into account the manufacturer and the supply chain considerations for these devices so that we can all be on the same page. From left to right, we start with the manufacturer of the medical device. So for medical devices included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, the manufacture of the medical device you wish to supply in Australia can only take place when there is a valid conformity assessment certification in place. If the certification lapses, is suspended or revoked, then the sponsor needs to notify the TGA within 60 days. We will touch on this in greater detail in webinar 3 and a little bit later in those examples, but for your awareness, we do have an online form and guidance documents to assist with this process. If the stock is manufactured overseas, it will make its way to the Australian sponsor. If the manufacturer or sponsor realise at this point that their medical device are no longer compliant with the essential principles, and that stock is within control of the sponsor and not yet supplied, consent to supply is required. The sponsor will need to apply for consent, which we will similarly touch on in greater detail in webinar 3 and in some of these examples. But for your awareness, similarly, we have an online form and we have lots of information on the website and guidance documents as well to assist with this process. Next, the stock will go to the distributor, the supplier, or straight to the customer. If at this stage the manufacturer or sponsor realise that their medical devices are no longer compliant with the essential principles, consent to supply is not required as the stock has already been supplied. However, recall actions or market notifications will be required if the stock that is in the market is unsafe or if there are changes that healthcare providers or end users would need to be made aware of. We'll now work through an example to highlight and clarify those regulatory obligations. The context for the example scenarios to follow is that of a hip implant that is currently included in the ARTG and is supported by an EU MDD certificate, which states that the hip implant is suitable for both the paediatric and the adult population. However, the EU MDR certificate has a reduced scope and states that the hip implant is only suitable for use in the adult population. So we'll cover 3 examples. The first example is for a non-transitioning device. That is, the manufacturer has decided not to seek further conformity certification, either EU MDR or anything else such as MDSAP. The second example is for a transitioning device with a gap in the certification, and the third example is for a transitioning device with overlapping certifications. In the first example, the manufacturer has decided not to transition their device and did not seek EU MDR certification or any other sort of certification. Under our legislation, sponsors must notify the TGA within 60 days of becoming aware of the lapsing, revocation, suspension, or cancellation of the conformity assessment certification. Therefore, the sponsor must notify us within 60 days of their EU MDD certification expiring. It's important to note that there are criminal and civil penalty sanctions if a sponsor fails to notify us within 60 days of becoming aware that a conformity assessment document, other than that issued by the TGA, has been restricted, suspended, revoked, or is no longer in effect. Now, this is just a notification form that is online and there is no fee involved in this. Generally, before the time of COVID and EU transition, if a manufacturer no longer held valid conformity assessment certification for 12 months, then the TGA would expect that all stock that was manufactured when the MDD certificate was valid would be rolled out within that 12-month period and supply would be ceased at 12 months. However, the TGA is mindful of current circumstances and will consider the lapses on a case-by-case basis and may contact sponsors at the 12-month mark to ascertain the situation. For your awareness, the TGA may cancel or suspend an ARTG entry that no longer has conformity assessment certification. Paragraph 41GN1G of the Therapeutic Goods Act, 1989, the Act, refers to cancellation of an ARTG entry where the conformity assessment document that applies to the kind of device expires, in case you were interested to go and look up that piece of legislation. Our approach to the cessation of supply is not dissimilar to that in Europe, where MDD compliant devices may be made available for a 12-month period post MDD certification, expiring until 27th of May 2025, and must then be removed from the market after this date, regardless of where that stock is in the supply chain. So that's just for your information on how this is looking in Europe as well. Okay, so we'll now provide you with some of those examples. Moving on to the second example, we have a gap in the certification between when the MDD certification expires and when the MDR certification is issued. As per example 1, the sponsor will need to notify the TGA within 60 days of their EU MDD certification expiry, and then let us know when the manufacturer receives the new certification. As I mentioned, there's a form for notifying us of the lapse of conformity assessment, and then you just simply need to email the TGA to let us know when the new certification is issued. And this, of course, is in our guidance document that is on our website. Upon issuance of the new MDR certification, the regulatory obligations and actions on the part of the sponsor will depend on whether the MDD stock is to be supplied with the old broad MDD indications and intended purpose, or with the new narrower MDR indications and intended purpose. Remembering here, our example is that a HIP that was originally intended for use in adults and pediatrics and now is only intended for use in adults. So we'll run through both possibilities. In this example, 2A, the sponsor is seeking to supply MDD stock with the narrower MDR indications. The sponsor will therefore need to update their labeling to remove the indications for use on children for their MDD stock in that red shaded box that you can see there. If the labeling is updated to remove the use for children, then consent to supply is not required for the MDD stock is compliant with the essential principles. So you can continue supply without notifying us of that or applying for consent. If the labeling is not updated to remove the use of children, then consent to supply is required for the MDD stock due to the non-compliance with Essential Principle 13. As I mentioned, there is an online form for this, and you can find more information in webinar 3. But we aim to make this process as streamlined as possible to minimize any disruption or avoid disruption in supply. However, if you, this is example 2B, the sponsor is seeking to supply the MDD stock with the broader MDD indications, that is, that it can be for use in children, and the manufacturer holds appropriate clinical evidence for use in children, wants to continue that supply of that stock in children post MDR certification, they are free to do so and do not need consent to supply. So please remember that the TGA, though, may ask for evidence at any time whilst the device is included in the ARTG, which the sponsor is required to provide within the 20 days. However, if the manufacturer does not hold appropriate clinical evidence for use in children and wants to continue to supply the MDD stock for use in children post MDR certification, an application for consent to supply will be required for that stock in that red shaded box due to the non-compliance against Essential Principle 14, which relates to clinical evidence. In this third example, there is an overlap in the validity of the MDD and MDR certificates. Manufacture and supply under both MDD and MDR certification with different indications is allowable if the relevant certification is in force and the manufacturer holds all the evidence to demonstrate compliance against all of the essential principles. As I mentioned before, if the sponsor is supplying MDD stock with the broader MDD indications post-issuance of the MDR certification, that is for use in both adults and children, as outlined in the red shaded box, the TGA may perform random checks prior to the EU MDR MDD certification expiring and request for evidence to verify compliance to Essential Principle 14. That is, we may ask you for the clinical evidence. At all times, consent to supply is not required if the device is compliant against the EPs, but the sponsor must notify the TGA within 60 days of their EU MDD certification expiring where there is a difference in the certification. And you can do that with the online form and then notify us by email when the new certification comes into force. And again, we may request clinical evidence demonstrating suitability of MDD stock for children in this case to determine on a case-by-case basis whether the MDD stock can continue to be supplied for use in children. We'll now touch on fees and charges and some of the fee reduction measures to relieve sponsors of that regulatory burden and cost, or to provide some relief. For consent to supply applications, a reduced fee of $30 per ARTG entry was introduced in September this year and will apply to sponsors of medical device ARTG inclusions. Applying for consent to supply medical devices whose non-compliance is limited to Essential Principle 13 only, that is, labelling only. This fee reduction measure will apply retrospectively to sponsors who have already made the application for consent from the 1st of January 2022. In addition, for device change request applications, a reduced fee of $190 per application will be considered by the government shortly, and if approved, will allow the update of up to 10 ARTG entries to the same manufacturer evidence identifier under one single reduced fee. Again, if approved, this reduction measure will apply retrospectively to sponsors who have already made the application from the 1st of January 2022. For all other changes, the standard fees apply. But please note that there is no charge for sponsors wishing to utilise the EU MDR web publication service or to notify for lapses in conformity assessment or lapses in certification. I do want to put in a shameless plug for our upcoming webinars. That is, the next webinar that we will hold will give you greater information on the EU, on the manufacturer's evidence and the variations to the ARTG in relation to the EU MDR transition. And the webinar on the 13th of December, that's webinar 3, will talk about consent to supply and market notifications, again, in relation to EU MDR transitions. We also have a series of website links there for you as well, which will hopefully be handy for those additional points that you need to look at. And of course, if you need to get in contact with us about any of these, please do just reach out and contact our EU MDR transition team. It is much easier if you just email us with any questions that you may have rather than making assumptions about any of this. We want to make this as streamlined as we possibly can.
Thanks, Cinlin and Amanda, for the presentation. So I'll take you all through some of the questions. So currently our top question is, for a foreign manufacturer, if I've decided not to obtain CE mark under EU MDR, what actions do I need to take within Australia?
Thank you, Ben. So as Amanda had outlined, if you do hold a MDD conformity assessment certification and you are not seeking to transition to the EU MDR and are not seeking to obtain any other conformity assessment certification, such as the US FDA, for instance, then you can continue to manufacture your devices whilst your certification is valid. Sponsors are required to notify us within 60 days of their certification lapsing or expiring, and can supply the devices that were manufactured under a valid certificate for a 12-month period, but are expected to cease supply thereafter.
Thank you, Cinlin. Will UK conformity assessment certification be accepted by the TGA?
So at this stage, the UK is not recognised under the TGA's comparable overseas regulator arrangements for medical devices. The UK is currently considering longer-term options for the ongoing regulation of medical devices. And this is not expected to cause any practical issues as such, given that 2 of the UK conformity assessment bodies, which are formally notified bodies, are also operating as NBs in the EU. And so in practice, they are likely to issue both CE and UK CA certificates for products. But if manufacturers or sponsors are experiencing any issues, please do get in touch with us. And this will be reviewed as the details of the UK plans for ongoing regulatory arrangements are released.
Great, thank you. If EU MDR has reclassified a medical device to non-medical device, will TGA reclassify as per MDR?
So whether a product is regulated as a medical device in Australia will depend on whether it meets the definition of a medical device under our legislation. So at times there are products which are regulated as medical devices in Europe, but are medicines in Australia, or products that are regulated at a lower classification in Europe, but is of a higher classification in Australia. So therefore, the regulatory pathway and classification will depend on the product's intended use, our legislation definitions, and classification rules.
Thank you. From Ju, what is the legislative basis for the 12-month time period?
Rather than being the legislative basis is that if an ARTG entry does not have valid conformity assessment certificate, the TGA may cancel that ARTG entry. There's no time frame on when the TGA may cancel that ARTG entry. Instead, what we want to take is an approach that is going to minimize supply disruption. So we're looking at the information that we can make a risk-based assessment on whether we should maintain that ARTG entry or whether that should be cancelled. So 41GN is the part of the Therapeutic Goods Act that needs to be referred to.
Great, thank you, Amanda. Is there any additional labelling requirements from the TGA to indicate that the device is compliant with MDR?
Labeling requirements are under EP 13 under our legislation. There aren't specific labeling requirements as such associated with the MDR. There will be a requirement under Australia. Our rules and regulations haven't changed. So it's more that if the sponsors are amending, for instance, For instance, MRI safety or MRI conditions, for instance, that will be relevant under our framework, and we will require an update to those. So I guess it's really dependent on what is within our framework, and we do need them to be compliant against all essential principles.
Thank you, Zillian. Are there any changes to products registered with MDSAP certification? Also, what about Class 1 devices?
This transition is specific to Europe. So it's the Europe Medical Devices Directives transitioning to the medical device regulations. The MDSAP certifications aren't affected by this as such. Class 1 devices under the Australian regulatory framework, we are dependent on the manufacturer having their declaration of conformity. So again, that is quite distinct to this specific transition.
Great, thank you. If our manufacturer's MDD certificate, Medical Device Directive certificate, expires, but they are expecting an MDR, Medical Device Regulations, but there is going to be a delay, if we have an appropriate COR, comparable overseas regulator, are we required to link this ME during this gap? Or is it sufficient to submit this to the TGA as ME and keep our internal records updated?
So at all times, sponsors should have up-to-date and valid manufacturer evidence and hold evidence of that. If sponsors wishes to do so, they could update their manufacturer evidence on file to the appropriate COR documentation should their MDD certificate expires.
Thank you. What is the approval timeframe for a consent to supply?
So that's a tricky question because it depends on how complex the application is for consent to supply. But if this is a simple labeling request for consent to supply, this can happen over a couple of days or within days once the application is paid. And so it is important to remember that those applications don't come to us until they are paid. But also remember that there is guidance there as well around what you need to submit with that application for the consent. What we're looking for is really a risk mitigation plan. And so if you have a sturdy risk mitigation plan, that will go a long way with a speedy process for your consent applications.
Thanks, Amanda. We are having reclassification issues with TGA. MDR class of device is not in line with the TGA classification. Overseas manufacturers will not change their classes of devices to match the TGA. How do we handle this?
Thank you, Ben. This is a challenging one, which we are working through. So we are aware with the reclassification reforms that took place in November 2021, there are instances where the classification of the devices are not the same. And we have also at times noted inconsistencies between notified bodies in Europe, which is also adding to the problem. We are working through this and seeking the assistance of the EC as well to try and resolve this, bearing in mind that there will be times, as mentioned earlier, where we will be having different classifications as a result of the different classification rules between Europe and Australia.
Thanks, Xin-Lin. Should changes in IFU and labels without affecting quality, safety, or performance be informed to the TGA?
So this could relate, for instance, to the streamlined market notifications. So there will be times, for instance, in the examples outlined by Amanda, where if there is a change into the class of persons for which the device is suitable for, but it does not impact on the actual quality or safety, that could well be a market notification that will need to be made out to end users and consumers so that they are aware that there is a change in the usage of this particular device.
Great, thank you. When are the changes going to happen? How much disruption will this cause for existing approvals and also new approvals?
Right, so the changes are already happening and will continue through to 2024 as notified bodies in Europe assesses and issues MDR certifications to manufacturers. The approval processes remain the same for both existing and new applications. With the repeal of the Regulation 4.1 and amendments to Regulation 5.3, and as manufacturers transition from the EU MDD to the EU MDR, we are seeing a reduction in the number of applications which are being subjected to mandatory audits. And the number of applications supported by EU MDR certification, which are selected for non-mandatory audits, are also coming down. So where possible, we will be streamlining our processes to minimize approval delays.
Great. So the next one is, can we use one form to submit all EU MDR changes for one medical device system where it has multiple ARTGs, GMDNs, and intended purpose?
Right, wouldn't it be amazing if we could do that with just one single form? So depending on what the changes are, sponsors will need to use the appropriate form for the change. So if sponsors are seeking to update their GMDN codes to a more relevant one, which does not change the kind of device, then that will require a device change request. And similarly, for intended purpose changes, there would also be a device change request. To update manufacturer evidence on file, there could be a new ME application or an ME variation application. And for changes to device classifications, that will require a new application for inclusion.
Thank you. I have a confirmation question. So to confirm, are we required to submit a notification to the TGA regarding lapse of conformity assessment within 60 days of certificate expiry, or when we're advised by the manufacturer of the delay?
So as a sponsor, you're required to notify the TGA of within 60 days of becoming aware. We don't expect you to notify us if you haven't been informed, but we do expect you to keep an eye on those dates when your manufacturer's evidence is going to expire, and so that can be so that you make sure that you have appropriate conformity assessment certification in place. So it is 60 days when you become aware.
Thank you, Amanda. For devices that have numerous versions, some versions have gone through MDR and some will remain on MDD. What is the time period for the device versions that have gone through MDR to be listed on ARTG using the new MDR conformity assessment certificate if there are no changes to the device except for the conformity assessment?
I'm hoping I've understood this question correctly. So I think this goes back to one of the examples Amanda had outlined earlier. So essentially, sponsors can continue to supply devices if they hold evidence, appropriate evidence for that. So if you have older versions which are covered within the scope of your older MDD certification, you can continue to supply that as long as you hold the evidence that you could do so. And similarly for the newer versions which are under MDR certifications.
Thank you, Celine. Is it possible to apply for a consent to supply due to not having a conformity assessment procedure certificate rather than meeting the APs?
No, so unfortunately not, Gary. So the consent is for consent to supply or import or export medical devices that do not meet the essential principles. So we have shortened it because it's such a long blurb to say each time. But if you have a lapse in conformity assessment certification, then you do need to notify us using the notification form. Good news is there's no fee for that. Whereas a consent to supply application, there is a fee associated with that. But they are two different things that cannot be done on the same form.
Thanks, Amanda. What happens if we are the distributor and the sponsor?
You should put your sponsor hat on always first. If you have control of the medical device, of the product, you are the sponsor. So apply those rules where it sits.
Thanks. I have a Class 1S product that is considered 510K exempt under the FDA. Will TGA accept FDA 510K exempt status?
Right, this is a real challenge when we have different regulatory frameworks across different jurisdictions. So within the Australian framework, we have to go with what is in the 2018 determination of information that must accompany medical devices applications for inclusions. And so we will require a 510K if seeking a US FDA, seeking that particular pathway. Unfortunately, or if the sponsor has alternative comparable overseas regulator certification or evidence.
Thank you, Celine. Keeping in mind time, we have about 2 minutes left. There may be 1 or 2 more questions. So, Class 3 medical device containing HA, assuming hyaluronic acid, registered in ARTG with EU MDD certificates, but unable to obtain the MDR certificate before MDD expires.
So the same process applies that was outlined by Amanda earlier. If the MDR certification is in progress, then example 2 would apply where there is actually a gap in the certification. Sponsors will need to notify the TGA within 60 days of their MDD certification expiring, and we do expect supply to be ceasing within a 12-month period unless the MDR certification comes within that time period.
Great, thank you. And I think last question now. So regarding ME variations, it was previously advised we could wait till all devices or ARTGs under an MDD certificate had been transferred to MDR before updating the ME TGA website. Is this still the case?
Yes, so there are instances where, for instance, a single ARTG entry could have multiple devices, and they could, due to the MDR, be supported by different certifications, and the question is whether that needs to be updated instantaneously, or whether that could be delayed till all devices have been updated. All certifications have been updated for all devices, and it's really dependent on a sponsor preference, and they could do either. And as long as they hold a relevant evidence, either is fine for us.
Thank you very much, everyone. So we have come on to 2 o'clock now, and look, we understand that there were many of questions that our team were not able to completely get to. So we do have the email address here for the EU MDR transition team. And Jingling, can you advise, like, would there be like frequently asked questions or anything like that, so we can, or how will you be addressing these last questions that we're not able to get through?
Sure. I would just like to reiterate that with the suite of guidance material that is available on our website now, which has been segmented to lots of different categories, there are example scenarios and FAQs available for each of the topics, and you might well find the answers to your questions there. For those that we have not covered and isn't already available on our website, we will be considering including them in our FAQ documentation. And otherwise, we're happy to answer any queries that comes through the EU MDR transition mailbox. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you very much to you both. And we look forward to seeing you all again, possibly at our next couple of webinars. So we do have some other speakers attending our number 2 webinar being hosted tomorrow, and again, another one next Tuesday between 1 to 2. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all.